If you've been watching The Last of Us on HBO and are unfamiliar with the video game series or even need a quick refresher, today's video is going to cover the main warring factions that are active during the first season of the show. The two primary parties at odds in this world are Fedra, the Federal Disaster Response Agency, and the Fireflies, an organized and militant group of rebels who have been actively opposing federal occupation of various quarantine zones around the United States. Let's start today's video with another quick history lesson. As we all know, in the year 2003, the US government was a well-oiled machine. It was doing a really good job of taking care of important issues in society. Nope, not a single problem with the government back then, right? They definitely would have been able to handle a global outbreak of a mutant fungus pretty easily. Or so we thought. Well, it turns out they had a couple of hiccups, leading to the end of the entire world. As the world began to stumble out of control, the fictionalized version of various world governments decided to take swift and decisive action. They did what any rational government would do in this exact scenario, i.e., they started bombing various US and world cities in an attempt to kill as many infected as possible, with little to no regard for the remaining human life in the areas. And that brings us to the creation of Fedra, the sort of amalgamation of multiple real-world federal entities. For those of you who might believe this organization is real, it's not. It's modeled off of others, but technically not officially a real thing. But basically, you can think of it as if the military was in charge of FEMA. We find out that just within a few short weeks after the infection began, the US government was effectively changed and the Federal Disaster Response Agency became the ruling authoritarian party. For a country that loves a good organized militia concept, it became evident that Fedra would be in charge, as they quickly secured leadership within the known quarantine zones through military enforcement, working to establish policies and protocols designed to keep people within the zones safe while establishing tight restrictions on the uninfected. Fedra commanded what was left of the US military and their equipment and drafted both volunteers for duty as well as enforcing mandatory service. While Fedra does have a central command group, we haven't met anyone in the game series from Fedra Command, nor within the show. A collectible called Lieutenant Torres's Final Memo mentions Fedra Central Command, who he has to report to, but that's really all we have. As the infection first began to break out, Fedra worked to round people up and check them en masse for signs of infection. They developed the capacity to check incoming refugees for signs of infection, both from physical inspection and by checking their blood. They do this using what's called a CBI scanner, short for cordyceps brain infection, a tool that monitors temperature, heart rate, and blood pressure. Fedra developed it to check the host for signs of infection, and while it's not officially confirmed, I think it was also created to play Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, which were the top-selling games of 2003, and most definitely would have been delayed in this timeline because of the infection, so of course, you'd need a handy device to play them. After being scanned, survivors would be moved, and based upon their condition, they were moved to either a safer quarantine zone within larger cities like Boston, Pittsburgh, Seattle, and others, or, if they weren't, they would go live on a farm with other survivors where they had plenty of room to run. Within the quarantine zones, or QZs, Fedra has various offices and chains of command. But the game series, and so far the show, do not outline who is directly in control of each. It is believed that as communication broke down, so did the chain of command, and each QZ began effectively governing itself based on pre-established guidelines. There is a newspaper shown in concept art that mentions that for at least a period of time, there may have been one final president. However, the president wasn't mentioned in anything else that I could find. However, over the 20 years that take place between the outbreak and the point when the show begins, there have been pretty drastic increases in the power that Fedra wields. Fedra rules these quarantine zones with an iron fist. In the first game, there is a collectible called Note to Wife that shows, at least for a period of time, it was possible to send mail from one QZ to another. However, as time progressed, it became more dangerous to send mail, and that option went away, which nearly led to riots as no one was able to receive their monthly Nintendo powers any longer. Additionally, Fedra established their own school system within the QZs in order to educate the youth and prepare them for service and indoctrinate them into Fedra's way of thinking. Although it certainly appears that the quality of that education and how many people view it is less than enthusiastic. But Fedra is not the all-powerful Big Brother entity that my initial description may have led you to believe. As Fedra attempted to crack down, they ultimately began stripping people of many of their fundamental human rights, and were particularly ruthless towards people who didn't fall in line. Despite your feelings on challenging authority, Fedra started to gain quite a lot of enemies as their punishments became more and more brutal for even the slightest infractions. Leaving QZs or abandoning jobs were particularly heinous crimes in their eyes, often resulting in exile or even public execution. This brutal behavior led to various uprisings and militias forming. As is often the case, the more Fedra attempted to tighten its grip, the more people and the quarantine zones these people lived in slipped through their fingers. Mass protests, uprisings, and revolutions began. There are multiple uprisings across the country, and as time progresses, we will discuss each of the different groups to liberate their own QZs, but today we want to discuss the most prominent one. The largest and most important resistance group to Fedra's occupation and rule within the world of The Last of Us is the Fireflies. The Fireflies were created and led by a woman named Marlene, who spent her life living and fighting against Fedra in one of the last Fedra-occupied cities, Boston. While Fedra makes the Fireflies out to be anarchists, they are quite the opposite. In fact, their goal is to reestablish a true democratic American government that can work toward finding a cure for the global pandemic and bring society back from the brink of extinction. Marlene has close ties with any and everyone who can help her wrest control of resources that Fedra controls. Fireflies are viewed as terrorists by Fedra, which leads to the involved members needing to hide their identities. Oftentimes, Fireflies will wear pendants as a form of identification from spies attempting to infiltrate the group. Fireflies were able to successfully liberate a number of large cities from Fedra rule, but in the process, the people of the cities suffered a tremendous amount of loss fighting the military, and in many cases, the quality of life did not improve. They also suffered from tremendous infighting. As global communication was all but impossible, many Firefly cells were in open rebellion with Marlene. In Pittsburgh, they used siege warfare and guerrilla tactics to win a 14-month prolonged engagement, but after they gained control of the city, it quickly spun out of control. Within the show, they swapped the events in Pittsburgh for Kansas City because logistically it made more sense for them to travel there. And this is a perfect example of the chaos that can occur when power vacuums form. The Fireflies have at points had a centralized base of operations, first being located in Colorado, but having been abandoned after a bloater was present. At the time of the first season of the show, 20 years into the future, their base of operations is located in St. Mary's Hospital in Seattle, Washington. At this location, they have a doctor named Jerry Anderson who is working on a vaccine needed to cure the brain infection. Prolific Fireflies that we meet within the series are Marlene, the leader of the Fireflies in both the show and the game series, Tommy, Joel's brother, a former Firefly who joined because he believed in the cause, or as Joel stated, because he is a joiner, someone who is idealistic and wants to be a hero. Riley, Ellie's best friend, who is the star of the Left Behind DLC content, whom we have heard mentioned in the show and is confirmed to be shown in flashbacks. And we will meet others like Dr. Jerry Anderson, who we mentioned previously, as well as his daughter, Abby. Ultimately, a number of changes are being made within the show to address the Fedra and Fireflies' power struggle. Pedro Pascal described the story of The Last of Us as a new kind of apocalypse where humanity struggles with its compulsion to dominate. Craig Mazin, the executive producer, mentioned that The Last of Us is, at its core, the story of Joel and Ellie becoming a team. But to me, the story of the Fireflies and Fedra is a perfect analogy for humanity's inability to form a team and work together. Even while in the grasp of a horrific, world-devouring pandemic, we couldn't figure out a way to work together or be good to one another. I think that element of the story really rings true after the last few years. So let us know down in the comments what you think of Fedra, what you think of the Fireflies, and what content you would like to hear more about from the Last of Us universe. That's going to be it for us today. Thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe. It really does help us out. And again, leave a comment down below. And remember the motto, it's The Last of Us over everything. And we'll see you guys next time.